Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out to the San Antonio Cloud Computing Meetup Group. I'd like to give a special thank you to the .NET Foundation for hosting this and making this possible, as well as a special thank you to Jeremy Sinclair for producing this event. At our last meetup, we welcomed Christos Matskis and had a great session on secretless apps using Azure. No announcements for future events coming up, but yeah, go ahead and welcome Cecil Phillip. How you doing?
Pretty good, man. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We're very excited to have you here.
Awesome. So you want to just go ahead and get into it, or like what do we do now?
Yeah, go ahead, and the floor is all yours. If you have anything from me, I'll be watching the chat and relay anything to you. Although you're a pro at this, so I know you're very skilled at teaching and interacting with the people. So I'll let you roll and just hang out.
Awesome. Thank you, man. I just really hope everyone enjoys the session. Kind of like Kellen said before, my name is Cecil Phillip. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. Me and my team, we really focus on, developer education, developer relations, and, just making sure that everyone has a really good experience, like building and using our tools and, just really trying to achieve whatever they are trying to achieve with the application that they're trying to build. Now, what I want to talk to everyone about today is a technology that I've been working on and working with for probably about the past year or so. It's called Dapr, right? And Dapr really makes it easy or easier to start building distributed systems type applications, cloud native applications, microservice applications, whatever term or technology that you kind of want to slide into that slot. I think Dapr makes it really easy or much easier for you to do it. And what I want to do is show you how exactly that happens. Now, I know for me, again, this is a user group session. This is not a conference or build or anything like that. I want everyone to feel comfortable. I want everyone to feel free to go ahead and ask questions. I know the folks are going to be monitoring and asking questions and stuff like monitoring the questions and things of that nature. I'll be peeking in at the chat too a little bit. I see some folks. Oh, wow. We got some folks here from Miami. That's awesome. My buddy Jose is here from Brazil. I'm from Antigua, if anyone's wondering where I'm from. I live in Florida, but, originally I'm a Caribbean boy. So, shout out to anybody that's here from the Caribbean. But with that being said, how about we just go ahead and get into it, right? And again, like I said before, feel free to go ahead and just pop in questions as things happen, right? We don't have to wait to the end or anything like that. So let's talk about Dapr. And let's talk about a little bit of why the team built Dapr. Like why do we think this was a good idea to make this technology and offer it to everybody? And I'm assuming that most of you folks are developers, or you work with developers, or you have developers on your team and things of that nature. And when we think about building applications today, and particularly applications that need to scale, there's a lot of problems that developers need to kind of figure out, right? There's things that they have to sort out as they're trying to be successful in these apps. And, that, for instance, is things like, what type of infrastructure am I going to use to build my application? What kind of programming languages I'm going to need to use? Sometimes I might need to use multiple programming languages because, one language might be stronger in doing something else than the other one, right? And then as I'm trying to take my monolithic application, right, like my big app that kind of has everything kind of bundled in together, how can I start to make use of some of those microservice patterns and practices that I hear a lot of folks talking about and really start to decompose my app into to these smaller pieces? Because if you think about why we want to do microservice applications and architectures, and I'm not going to talk about what they are because, I know everyone has a different opinion about what constitutes a microservice and how it's set up. But when we just look at it from the perspective of, I want to be able to scale my applications. And so I want to be able to scale it in a way that really makes sense. So let's say, imagine I have a shopping cart service, or maybe I have I'm doing fleet tracking or something like that, right? And there may be times of the year or moments throughout the day that the load increases and it comes back down, right? And it has to be very dynamic. And before, what we used to do is, we'll just throw hardware at it, right? We'll just buy more VMs. But over time, I think we've realized just throwing VMs at the problem is not really the best solution, particularly when it comes to the expense and the management of those things. right? And so now, like, we're instead of like, throwing VMs in it, we're trying to decompose our apps into these smaller pieces. And now we can intelligently scale those smaller pieces as it makes sense. So again, like imagine we have like some type of online store or something of that nature. And I don't know, it's Christmas or it's Black Friday or it's some special holiday in whatever country that you're in. And you're like, okay, I need to, scale up like the inventory service, like the thing that's like serving the product data, or I need to scale up like the payment processing thing, the thing that's taking money and charging folks, charging your credit card or your bank account. Now, I don't want to copy the entire app to do that. I just want to copy, or I just want to scale the little part of it that's going to, deal with that work, like the hot path of my application. You know what I mean? So that's where microservices kind of help out, where like I could just scale the little thing, like the little piece of my app or the service in my code that's really doing the work and really needs like more resources. And the other parts of it, I can kind of just leave it alone. Right. And then now we can start to more intelligently make use of our resources, our servers, our VMs, and things of that nature a little bit better. So, I mean, that sounds like, okay, well, that's not so hard to do, but it actually turns out like there's a lot of challenges when it comes to building like these microservices, these distributed, cloud native applications. And a couple of those reasons really have to do with the fact that, when you kind of look across the landscape today, like there's just so much choice for things that you might want to do within your app. So for instance, some of the things we might want to do is like distributed tracing, right? Like now, if I don't have one huge app and I have a bunch of smaller apps, how can I figure out like what's the path the code is taking throughout these different services, right? I need to be able to trace that. Or let's say I want to do something like messaging. I want to do pub sub, or I might need to do service discovery, right? Like service discovery being, hey, I have all these services that compose together to make my solution. How do I know where they are? How do I know how many they are? How do I know if they're healthy, right? Like, how do I know I should, use this one versus the other one? And then again, as we think about like, how microservices are somewhat dynamic, right? Like I can have 2 instances of a thing or 1 instance of a thing or 100 instances of a single service. Like, how do I know what the address is? How do I know how to get there? How do I know whether it's up or it's down or whatever the case is? And, in addition to that, like when we kind of look across the ecosystem, there's so many options for things that we could use to kind of plug into that space. So again, like let's say I want to do messaging. Well, there's RabbitMQ, there's ActiveMQ. I could use a hosted service in the cloud like Azure Service Bus or SQS, or what if I want to do like something like tracing, like I mentioned before, right? Or what if I wanted to do state management? What kind of database do I want to use? What kind of caching service do I want to use, right? And so now for all of us as developers, we have to try and figure out, what's the right combination of these things that makes sense, right? At least makes sense for like the feature set and the thing that we're trying to build. And then not only that, but we have to think about, well, what are the programming languages that it supports? So for instance, one service might, have better Python support. One service might have better .NET support. One might work better with Java, right? And, or do you want to learn all these different programming languages just to be able to work with these services? Or, are you going to have to write like additional wrappers and more code to try and manage these inside of your ecosystem? Again, it becomes a little bit hard. It becomes a little bit distracting because now, instead of you really just focusing on writing code and solving business problems, now you're trying to like, figure out the infrastructure, right? Like now you're trying to figure out like, how do I plug these things together just so I can get my job done? And again, it really starts to take up some time. And again, here's another example like of how an application might be decomposed, right? I might have my front end application, and then maybe there's like, a cart database, and then there's a checkout service, and then there's inventory and all these types of things. But at the end of the day, like I need to be able to like attach that to something. Like in this case, we're using Cosmos DB and Kafka, right? Cosmos for storing our state and Kafka for doing something like, sending messages or, doing pub sub, for instance, or at least just being able to like look at that, like that Kafka ledger, right? Like we always talk about like that ledger of messages that we can look backward and forwards in time and try and understand what's going on. So, long story short, this is kind of where Dapr comes into play, right? What Dapr is a pretty much an open platform, a runtime that will allow you to build microservices a little bit easier by using some common abstractions that the team decided, well, these are the most common patterns and practices that people that are building cloud native microservice applications are using. And so let's create this abstraction that developers could focus on using instead of worrying about like, the implementation of those things. And that should make it a little bit easier and a little bit faster to adopt this type of patterns inside of our apps. And again, our developers have to worry about those other things that are happening on the backside of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've always heard software development or computer science in terms of the human side of it, and what we're really trying to do is manage complexity. And I like that you mentioned that it seems like Dapr is a relatively straightforward manner to manage a lot of those complexities, and that it kind of gives you I don't necessarily want to say a head start, but kind of something to work with, so that you're not just kind of getting lost in the details.
For sure. And, a common example I like to use when I talk to folks is, so let's say, hey, I want to do like a messaging thing, right? Like, let's say I want to use like some cloud hosted messaging service, right? Now, most of these things don't have like a local development instance. So now it's like, oh my gosh, like I got to connect to the cloud, and I got to do this auth handshake, and I got to figure that out. Or you might say, okay, well, we're still in the early stages of building our app. I don't know where we're going to be storing our information. Like, I don't know what I'm going to be using for caching. I don't know what I'm going to be using for some of these other components. But now I'm going to have to start bringing some of these libraries, these frameworks, these SDKs, Node packages, Java jars, .NET NuGet packages into my app. And then if I decide, hey, I don't want to use this anymore, then I got to uninstall, and I got to like retrofit my app, right? Like I got to, create another abstraction or another thing to be able to handle that. And, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to do that, right? Wouldn't it be great if you could just focus on, hey, I just want to build my app and let someone else deal with it. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what Dapr does, right? It doesn't remove the implementation, right? It doesn't remove the need for these things to be set up and configured. But what it does is it passes it down the line, right? And now it becomes more of like a DevOps thing and less of a code thing, right? So kind of like what we're looking at here, like with Dapr, you can make use of some of these common patterns and practices, and you could use any programming language that you want. Like, it doesn't matter, right? So, a lot of times you might be in an environment where, your system or, the things that you're working on are built up from multiple languages, right? Like I used to work at a stock trading company, prior to my current job. And, in that company, I would say like that company was a collection of other smaller companies that were acquired. And each of those smaller companies had a different programming language, right? So I was working with folks that did Ruby things and PHP things and Python things, but we're all building like the same stock trading, solution, right? Like it's the same product. Like when the user logs in, like they only see one web page, right? They don't see, okay, well, .NET people go here and Ruby people go to the other side. It's the same application. So we had to figure out a way in the middle to kind of have them talk to each other, right? And we had to write a lot of code and, a lot of, serialization code and messaging code and things of that nature to kind of make that work. We didn't have Dapr at the time. That would have been great if we had that. But, these are real problems that people have to do, right? And you have to spend, sprint time and developer cycles to kind of figure those things out. So this is one of the good things I think that Dapr gives us, right? We can use any language that we want to use, any language that speaks HTTP or gRPC. It's cloud agnostic, so this is not like an Azure thing. Like it doesn't only run in the cloud. It doesn't only run on Kubernetes. You can run it on your machine. You can run it local host if you want to. You can run it on your internal data center if you want to, or you can run it in the cloud if you want to, right? It's completely up to you. And on top of that, like it's open source, it's free, it's pluggable. So, one of the things you'll see as we go forward a little bit is like, the implementation and the abstractions that are created. A lot of them were submitted by folks in the community that they were like, oh, wow, this is really cool. Like I'm going to submit a PR and I'm going to add my component. I'm going to add my messaging thing. I'm going to add my DNS thing or whatever the case is to make it easier for me to use. And now by proxy, like everyone else will be able to use it too. So I've mentioned a few times about like these building blocks. So let's talk about what exactly these building blocks are, right? Like what are these patterns that Dapr kind of gives us? And like I said before, what happened was the team kind of did a survey. Like they looked around in the community, they spoke to customers and different folks, and they were like, okay, well, how are you building your apps today? Like, what are the things that you really care about? And so these are the collections of building blocks that the team was able to come up with. So again, you can see here on the left side, we have service to service invocation, which is like service discovery, state management, which is, it's like a key value store. Like I'm going to store and retrieve stuff. We can do pub sub. We have triggers if you're into that events driven type programming model where you can have input output bindings. Then there's actors, observability, secrets. And then obviously, like I mentioned before, it's extensible. So not only can you have your own implementation for each building block, you could, suggest or propose your own building block as well. And we could take that into the core, we could start building around that. Now, one of the cool things that you'll see also about these building blocks, and one of the reasons why they're so language agnostic, is because they're able to be built on top of these features or these standards that pretty much almost any programming language could use today. So let's say, I'm writing something in, I don't know, in Rust or Go, or I'm writing something in Haskell, right? Hypothetically, like some programming language, as long as it's able to talk HTTP or gRPC, you should be able to work with Dapr, which is great, right? Now, as you see here, like some of these things might have SDKs, like there's a Node SDK, there's a Python SDK, there's a .NET SDK, but the SDK is completely optional, right? The SDK is almost like syntactic sugar, right? Like, you don't have to use it if you don't want to, but if you do, then, there's definitely some niceties there that it kind of brings along the way. And again, like I said before, at the bottom, you can see like, we can host this anywhere. So we have folks from Alibaba Cloud, from AWS, Kubernetes, tons of folks that are contributing to this project as well. Now, how does Dapr kind of work? Let's kind of talk about the implementation a little bit. And again, also remember, anytime folks have questions, again, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we can always pause and rewind and talk about them. So the way that Dapr works is using the sidecar pattern. And, folks are familiar with things like service meshes or, those types of things. Like this might sound familiar to you. But essentially, you have an application. So you can see my app that's there on the left side. And you have your sidecar that's deployed next to every instance of your application, right? So when I say every instance, again, we think about microservices. If I have 5 instances, 5 copies of my app that are actively running, I should have 5 copies of my sidecar right next to it that are also actively running. And what the sidecar does is, one, like it's going to go look at your app and say, okay, this application, this service is available at this port. And these are the things that these are the topics that it wants to subscribe to. And these are the things that like it exposes to the world. And then from the perspective of your application now, what it's going to do is be able to talk to that Dapr sidecar whenever it wants to interact with the rest of the world, which is cool. So you can imagine here, for instance, if my app wants to talk to the shopping cart service, which might exist somewhere else, and again, it has its own Dapr sidecar, right? Because again, every service has its own Dapr sidecar. All my app has to do is just say, hey, I'm going to make a HTTP post request or a GET request, depending on what method you're trying to invoke, and say, hey, I want you to invoke the new order method on the cart service. And then you can kind of look at the URL and you can kind of read it out, right? Like invoke the cart service and call the method new order. And if we look at some of the other operations that are available, I could do the same thing with state, right? Like if I want to store something or if I want to retrieve some state, I can say, hey, Dapr, call the state service, call inventory, and give me item, number 67, if that makes sense.
We had a question in the chat. What is the difference between Dapr and a service fabric?
Oh, like a service mesh? Sure. So I'd say Dapr and service meshes offer almost slightly different like capabilities. A lot of our folks use Dapr and service meshes together. So if you look at our docs, you'll see Dapr running next to something like Open Service Mesh or next to something like Istio. So when you think about service meshes, those are, and again, from my perspective, those are more so aligned with like access control, with message routing, or I'm sorry, like traffic routing between components and things of that nature. Dapr is more so aligned around making patterns and abstractions available. So if I was supposed to scoot back a little bit, if I come back over here and I show you like the side here, where I show you some of these building blocks that Dapr has. So in addition to like the service-to-service communication, service meshes don't offer state stores and pub subs and actors and secret management and some of these other types of things, right? I almost want to say like service meshes in Dapr operate at different levels of your programming layer, right? So service meshes are almost like the communication layer, like where's traffic going? And Dapr is more like in your code, right? Like it's in your application. Like you program to Dapr, right? Like you call Dapr in your code. Like you say, hey, Dapr, give me my state. You say, Dapr, stand up and call this actor. You know what I mean? Like Dapr call this service for me, which is a little bit different for what from service meshes do. So let me know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking of it more in terms. It's kind of like a service mesh, maybe kind of maybe a transport and kind of access between different microservices or different parts of the app, where Dapr kind of exists as part of it and inside of it.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like Dapr, is almost like it's a part of your application, right? Like it's an API you call, and it's a service that you can consume, versus service meshes, which does provide, different capabilities to your application infrastructure, but it's not something like you don't call Istio or open service mesh from inside of your application. Okay. Any more questions?
I don't see any more at the moment, but I'll be sure to relay them if we see any.
All right, cool. All right, so there, as we're looking at the model, the sidecar model on the slide here, so you can see, there's a well-defined URL that lets us know which one of the building blocks that we're going to call. So the first one shows how we call the service invocation. The second one shows state management, and now the second one will show how we work with pub sub. So again, here you can see I want to publish a message to shipping. And then, the orders would be the topic. And then, inside of your HTTP payload, you'd have some JSON, payload or something like that you want to pass along that'll actually have the data that you want to share. And again, there's tons of services in here, right? So there's also secrets as well that we could do. But again, you could see the point, right? Like everything is really just a method call, right? It's just an HTTP method that we're calling. And so from that perspective, if your code knows how to speak to HTTP, it knows how to speak to Dapr. Okay, so these are the different building blocks that we talked about, right? State management, pub subs, secret management, there's actors, there's observability, there's tons of stuff. Now, let's talk about what happens on the other side, right? Like, so your app is going to go ahead and call these services through Dapr, but someone has to configure them. Like these services still need to exist. And so if you remember what I'm saying, the building blocks are essentially abstractions over real implementations. So if you can see here, for instance, if I needed a state store, I might choose to use Redis. I might choose to use Cosmos DB. I might, choose to use, DynamoDB or Cassandra or whatever the case is. But the thing is, like, my application never knows about it. Like, I never install like the node package, the jar, the .NET thing. Like, I don't have to do that if I don't want to, right? Like, I could really just focus on using the abstraction. The same thing with pub sub brokers, right? We could use Service Bus, we could use Redis, we could use RabbitMQ. Sometimes I'd like to tell folks, hey, whatever you want to use locally, use that, because maybe that makes sense, right? Use Redis locally, use RabbitMQ locally. But then when I publish my application to the cloud, I might want to use a hosted service instead. But whenever I'm switching over to that hosted service, my application code doesn't change. And that's something I want to keep hammering in for folks. My application code doesn't change, but all I have to do is like swap out the configuration, and now, it'll be pointing to a different thing. Obviously, please test out your configurations. Don't just swap your configuration, and make sure the right permissions and those types of things are set up. But in terms of like your business code, like we don't have to change anything there, which is amazing. And kind of like I mentioned before a little while ago, so we can host in a few different places. So we could self-host locally, or we could be in Kubernetes. And then for folks, some folks might be familiar with something called HashiCorp Nomad. So, all those type of environments, HashiCorp Nomad, Docker Compose, Docker Swarm, all of those types of things, Dapr works well in. And actually for my demo, when I start to show you all some code, like we're going to be looking at how to set up and run Dapr locally using Docker Compose. One, because, I think it's a little bit easier for me to demo than Kubernetes, because you can more clearly see what's happening. But then two, it allows you to run like multiples of instances of things. And then, so you can have a lot of stuff happening locally in your machine. Okay.
We got two more questions in the chat.
Sure.
One is, does it act like a message broker, something like in-service bus or mass transit?
No, it doesn't. So what it will do, so in-service bus and mass transit, like they add some additional like niceties, right? Like some additional developer things on top of the broker. All what Dapr is doing is it's giving you abstractions over these implementations, right? So particularly if we're talking about publish subscribe, your app says, or your app will define, hey, these are the topics that I'm interested in. And so when your Dapr sidecar that's right next to it starts up, it's going to keep looking at that implementation, right? That implementation might be Service Bus or RabbitMQ or Redis or whatever. It'll keep looking at the implementation that we set up in configuration, and it'll say, oh, okay, someone published a topic for this thing. I'm going to pass it along to my application that's associated with me. But that's really all it does, right? Like it's just monitoring, like, and passing those things back in for that particular use case. But I believe in Service Bus and Mass Transit, they do some other things like sagas and retries and tons of additional things like message transformations and stuff like that, and some more workflow oriented things. Like Dapr today doesn't do that inside of the pub sub abstraction.
All right, we'll ask the second question. Can we use Dapr with Project Tie?
You can use Dapr with Project Tie, and Project Tie actually has like a little extension. Actually, let me swing over to my browser really quickly. But yeah, if you look up Project Tie, I think that's in the .NET repo, if I'm not mistaken. Is this where it is? Yeah, there's actually a Dapr extension, isn't it? I'm trying to see, where is this? If you come over here to samples, there you go, Dapr, right? Here's even a pub sub extension. And so, yeah, you could totally use Dapr Tie. And again, it's just an extension, right? So like, you define extensions in the tie.yaml file, you specify Dapr, and, the rest of this stuff, you specify, some Dapr configuration. And then the rest of this is just the rest of your tie.yaml file. But yeah, you could totally do that for sure. Okay, no more questions? All right, let's keep it going. Let's see what we got. Right. So here's an example of it running locally on my machine, right? Or what it would look like running locally on your machine. And the way this actually happens is that, whenever you do Dapr run, right? So Dapr run is the CLI command, right? Like it's whenever you install Dapr, you'll get a Dapr Dapr and a Dapr D, like an executable that's on your machine. And then you could just say Dapr run your app, right? And so your app might be, .NET run, I don't know, web app 2020, right? Like whatever your app is called. And what it'll do, it'll stand up that sidecar and it'll stand up your application right next to it. And then it'll also look for those components, right? Like the configuration that you set up. And then also too, when you're running local in your machine, it's going to use your local Docker instance if you have Docker installed. But again, you don't have to use Docker if you don't want to. It's totally fine. And then also too, I mentioned before, like it also runs in Kubernetes. I'm not going to show a Kubernetes demo today, but I know a lot of folks always ask about it. The way that this works is that, there's this particular installation that works with Dapr on Kubernetes. And so what will happen is for every pod that you specify, and again, a pod is, like a container for, I shouldn't say container. A pod is like a little space that you have to put your containers in, right? If for folks that might not be familiar with Kubernetes. And so what Dapr would do is it'll put the sidecar right next to your application, right? So again, now when your app's talking to this Dapr thing that's inside of the pod, it's still just talking to local hosts, right? So again, your code, whether it's running in Kubernetes, talking to Dapr is the same way like you would be if you're running Dapr locally in your machine, right? Like it doesn't make any difference, right? And then again, it'll reach out, it'll look at some of these different state stores, wherever they happen to be, the different state stores, the pub sub brokers, these different components, and it'll go ahead and it'll set those things up. Okay, so we've been talking a lot. How about we start to get into some demos, right? Hopefully folks are like, okay, I get it. Abstractions, you could do stuff. Like, let me actually see what it looks like. Well, let's take a look first at service invocation and pub sub. Like we'll see what the flow looks like, and then we'll take a look at a demo and we'll see exactly how it works. So with service invocation, remember now, I have my app, my service, right? And if I have 10 apps, I have 10 Dapr sidecars. If I have 10 services, I have 10 Dapr sidecars. And what will happen is that like my app and the Dapr instance will, say, hey, I want you to call this service. And you can notice if you look at the URL that's defined there, I want you to call service A, right? And I want you on service A to call new order. And so the two Daprs now, since they're on the same network, right, they're going to use something called MDNS, multicast DNS. If they're in different environments, like they could use also things like, core DNS if we're in Kubernetes, and also too, they could use like an external DNS provider. But, for the sake of running locally, we're going to use MDNS, right, multicast DNS, and then it's going to establish a connection with some of the other Dapr sidecars that are there, right? So I'm going to say, oh, hey, I found this Dapr sidecar, and now it'll establish an MTLS connection. So MTLS being like mutual TLS, right? Like there's going to be certificates going both ways, right? From the client and the server, in this case, the two Dapr sidecars, to just make sure that that connection, that information that's going back and forth is encrypted, right? So you have a secure channel between these sidecars. So anyway, my app is going to say, hey, I want you to invoke the service, but your app doesn't know where the service is, right? Like Dapr knows where it is because it knows where the other sidecars are. So it knows where to forward your request to, and then your request or your service knows how to receive it, and then it's going to send your information back, right? And again, same way as you can imagine with the state service, right? Like you're going to say, hey, I want you to give me the state from this thing, right? I don't know where you're storing it. I just want you to store it for me. Like that's all I really care about. Like here's some information that I want you to put in there, right? And you can see it's giving you a key and the value. Now, if you're looking at here, I know folks always ask this, like the value could be a simple thing, a simple type, like an integer or string, or it could be as complex as, an array of objects or whatever the case is. Whatever you want to pass in there, as long as it's valid JSON, it'll be serialized and it'll be put inside of the CSOR, right? And then, like I said before, if we need to swap these things out, your app will be none the wiser, right? Like I can swap it out. As long as the information is there, Dapr will be able to pull it back for you. All right. So let's head over to VS Code. And what I want to do is show you an app. Or actually, let me head to my browser first. This was that was that thing I was showing you a little bit earlier. If I go to localhost, boom. So this app that I'm showing you right now, so this is a .NET application. It's using Blazor right now. So it's using server-side Blazor. And so this UI it's just, single page application, right? Like there's not a lot of crazy things happening here. But, as you can see, it's, fully functional app. I could do things like, I could rate things. I could add things to the cart. You know what I mean? I could click my cart. I could see, how many things that I ordered. I could scroll. I could click more things. I could add more things to the cart, right? And then I can hit submit. My cart's cleared. And then now I'm going to assume someone in the back office is going to go ahead and process that work order for me, right? Okay, so this app is not super complicated, but this app was actually decomposed into three very distinct services. So one, there's the UI service, right? Like there's this front, the front end of it. There's an application, this Blazor app that's, showing us the UI that we're looking at. There's the web API that has the information for each of these different products. And that's a completely separate service running in a different place. And then there's also the order or the checkout processor, right? So whenever I click these things, right, and I come up here and I hit submit, it's sending that into a queue. And then on the other side of that queue, I have some type of worker that's listening for messages to be put onto the queue so we can start processing them as they come out. Okay, so how do we implement this? Let's see how we actually Daperize this application. So let's head over to Visual Studio Code. And let's take a look first at just how this application is set up. I'm going to zoom into this a little bit. And so like I mentioned before, so there's three apps in here. And so hence the three folders, right? So I have this website app, I have this products API app, and I have this checkout processor app. And now all three of these apps are working with Dapr, right? To, send messages and figure out where each other are. The first thing I want to show you, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit now that you can see that. first thing I want to show you, I'm going to open my CS proj file. I want you to see how the CS proj file doesn't have a lot of stuff in there, right? It has nothing. It says nothing about state store. It doesn't say anything about Dapr. I don't have anything talking to me about publishing messages. There's no RabbitMQ references. There's no Redis references. There's nothing in here, right? It's pretty much just a bare bones Blazor app with exception of some, some design assets that have been put into it, right? And again, the same can be said about some of these other ones, right? So, I'll click through the rest of these. I'll open up the products API, right? The products API, this one only has a reference to MongoDB. But other than that, it doesn't know anything about Dapr. It doesn't know anything about the checkout processor. It doesn't know anything about the front end, right? And again, I'm just showing this to prove to y'all, like this thing knows nothing about Dapr. This thing only knows about cloud events. I'll tell you all about what cloud events are in a little bit. But as you can see, this checkout processor, whose job is to listen to a queue and pull messages off a queue, has no information in here that says anything about, I'm going to use RabbitMQ or Service Bus or SQS or anything of that sort. Like, it doesn't know anything about it. So how does this work, right? Like, how does it actually know how to send messages and work with Dapr? So let's start with the website, right? Because the website has to make a request whenever it stands up, and it has to say, hey, give me that product information, right? So inside of my Razor application, I'm going to go into the components folder. And inside of my components folder, I'm going to close this down a little bit. You can notice here that I'm making a call to this thing called product service, right? So again, we're looking through here. I'm using product services to add ratings and doing all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't know anything particularly about Dapr. And now if I look into, I should have a services folder somewhere in here. I have a thing here called Dapr product service. And all this is doing is I'm making use of the HTTP client factory. I don't know if everyone is a .NET person or not, but essentially this is just like a class that helps me create instances of HTTP client that I could use to make requests. And I'm saying, hey, create this HTTP client, right? It has the name Dapr, right? So this is the Dapr client I want you to use. And then I'm just making a request, right? So this request is saying, hey, I want you to send a patch request. It's sending an HTTP patch request over to this service. The service is called Products API. I'm calling the product service, right? And again, same thing with get products, right? You saw in the beginning, whenever my component starts up, wherever it opens up for the first time, all I'm doing is that I'm saying, hey, call the products API and call the product service. But again, notice the difference. This one's a get request and this one's a patch request, right? So again, I'm still able to use like my HTTP semantics on my service, you know what I mean? But the only thing that this application knows about is how to speak HTTP, right? Like that's the only thing that's going on here. Now, let's take a look at the products service a little bit. And this may or may not surprise you, but this is just a plain old, .NET controller, right? So if folks are familiar with .NET, we create controllers to handle HTTP and web requests. And here you can see, whenever you make a call to /products, right? If you do a get request, I'm going to call this get list thing, and it's going to pull some stuff out of the database. If I want to get a product by ID, right? The patch request, so on and so forth, right? But again, like there's nothing in here that says anything about Dapr, right? I have done nothing special to this application. Now, so you might be asking, okay, how does my app know where Dapr is? How does it know, okay, the URLs are set up, but like, how does it know where, like, what's the port and what's the IP address? Like, where's this stuff set up, right? So if we go back to the website, because remember, we have the website's going to call that product service. If we head over to the website, and again, this is very .NET specific, but again, this really has nothing to do with .NET. This is just how we implement it, right? Inside of our configure services, right? Like I'm configuring an HTTP client with this name, and I'm just saying, hey, anytime someone asks for a Dapr client, just give them a thing with this address and port, right? And so I'm assuming that Dapr is going to be running on 3500. But that's it, right? Like notice nothing else in here. I don't have any API keys in here. There's no security tokens and all this types of stuff, right? I'm pretty much just saying, hey, when the HTTP client factory gets asked to give them a thing of Dapr that looks like this, return, give me something with this base address. Okay, all right. So any questions about that so far before I move on a little bit?
I don't see any more questions, but yeah, you did kind of answer and ask that question before. I was going to ask it myself about kind of how does it implement it? How does it know where it is? And how does it keep it from being my problem?
Sure. So we've seen what the code looks like, right? At least we've seen what the code looks like from the website and from the products API perspective. Now let's talk about how is it actually running. Now, like we showed before, like you can host Dapr in a few different places. You can host it localhost. You can run it in Kubernetes. Me personally, I'm running it in Docker Compose on my machine, right? And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like. Now, if you look here on the right side, I have 2 Docker Compose files. And also, if anyone's not familiar with Docker Compose, again, just send us a message, just ask the question, and we could pause and we could dive into it, right? So I have 2 Docker Compose files, and I did that specifically because I wanted to have one Compose file for my application, one Compose file for my infrastructure pieces. Because again, everything I'm running and I'm showing you is happening on localhost. Like I'm not going into the cloud or outer space to like call anything. Like everything's happening right here. So if I show you what's inside of the infrastructure, right? I'm using MongoDB, to store my information. I have RabbitMQ and Redis here, right, for my state store, for caching, and also for sending messages and things of that nature, right? There's HashiCorp Vault as the implementation of secrets, if I needed to use that. And I also have Zipkin here, right? It's like Zipkin is a tool that does distributed tracing. And I'll show you a little bit what that distributed tracing piece looks like. But again, this is just infrastructure. There's no Dapr things inside of this particular Compose file. So now what this allows me to do is I could say Docker Compose up, and now I'll just have these services that are just running on my network, my virtual network that Docker has created for me. Now, this is where the good stuff is, right? Like if we take a look at this Compose file, and I'm going to collapse some of these things, right? So each one of these things represents a service and a Dapr sidecar. So if you remember what I said before, for every instance of your app you get to have a Dapr sidecar. So here you can see I have a website, Dapr sidecar. Products API sidecar. Checkout processor sidecar. Again, you kind of get the point, right? Like app sidecar. Like that's it, right? Like say it to yourself when you leave the session, like app sidecar. Like that's how Dapr works, right? And if we took a look at what's inside of these, so again, this is very Docker Compose specific, right? So what we're doing is I'm just telling it to build my application, using the code that I have, and I want you to run it on port 80, right? So that's why when you see I run the app, I'm able to just hit it on localhost, right? And then there's some configuration things that's going on here, but for the most part, that's what's happening. Now, the cool part here is when I'm actually calling Dapr, right? So what I'm using here, I'm using Dapr D. So the D just stands for daemon, right? So I'm using the Dapr daemon. And here's the good stuff, right? Like this is where you could see how I configure Dapr to know where my application is, right? Because you got to remember, when Dapr and your application are running, they're expecting each other to be on localhost, right? So here I'm giving my app a name. So app ID is website. So that's the name of my application or the name of my service as far as Dapr is concerned. Then I'm going to have an app port. So the port my app is running on is on port 80. And again, that's port 80 on localhost. And then here I'm pointing to some configuration, right? So there's a components path where I configure all of those components that I talked to you about, like those things that implements my Dapr components. And then also I just have some basic configuration here. But again, you'll notice everything here is pretty much the same. Like it's almost like a copy paste job. As developers, we like to copy paste stuff. But this is the same thing, right? What's the name of my app? Products API. What port is it on? Port 80. Where's the configuration? Here's it is, right? And it's all pointing to the same place, right? So on and so forth. So again, like as we're setting this up inside of Docker Compose, you set up your application and then you set up your sidecar. And then, notice how all of these also too, you might notice this, all of these are pretty much running on the same port, right? Because, from the perspective of Dapr, like we're all in the same place. So this thinks the products API is on port 80 because it is within the container, right? Just like the checkout processor is in the container, right? So now whenever I start it up, all that's going to happen is Docker Compose is going to start up each of these things, and then Dapr is going to be able to say, oh, okay, well, this is where it is. Now I know how to set these things up. Okay. All right. Let's go back to the slides. I'll show you all how to configure these things in a second, but let's head back to the slides and kind of keep it going. Okay. So let's talk about publish subscribe. So the publish subscribe facility in Dapr is based on, it's like a simple abstraction that's based on topics, right? So again, whatever the implementation is, I have to give it the data and the topic that I want to publish to. And also my app or my service that's on the either side, my service has to say, well, what's the topic that I want to subscribe to, which is cool. So now using HTTP, I don't need to know, am I using AMQP? Am I using MQTT? Whatever publishing thing that you're using, like my app doesn't need to know about it. And I don't have to have a client that could talk to it. Again, all I need to know is, hey, what do you want me to send a message? Here's where it's going to go. All right, great. And that works out just fine. And the same thing with secrets, right? I'm sure y'all are going to get tired of me saying, all you got to do is just make this HTTP call. But I mean, honestly, that's really what it is, right? You're making HTTP calls to access these different building blocks. And then once we have them configured at the other side, then Dapr is going to make it a lot easier for us to start working with, right? And also the same with the observability pieces as well. So let's take a look back at our application and let's look over something really quickly. So you remember I said before, right? So whenever I hit the submit button, it's going to send out a message and it's going to publish it to whatever the thing that's configured, right? Well, that instance, that RabbitMQ thing that I'm using, because you saw I had it there in my Docker Compose file, that RabbitMQ thing that I had was not, it's not code that I control. It's code that we have to configure, right? It's an app that I have to configure. So how do we do that? And if we head back over here, I'm going to go back to my code base. Now you might notice this. I'm going to zoom in just for a brief moment, but you might notice that there's a thing here called components. And if you remember when I was showing you my Docker Compose file for my sidecars, I had this thing called components, but I also had this thing called configuration, right? This config.yaml. So let's take a look inside of these things and see how exactly we set some of this stuff up from the other side. Again, this is not stuff that like you have to do as a programmer, but like, someone has to set this up for you, whenever you deploy it. Now to configure Dapr, we have to use YAML because, YAML is just kind of how people do microservice things these days. And here's an example of how you can configure RabbitMQ using Dapr, right? So, I give it some metadata, it has a name. And then here is the part where you kind of specify the configuration, right? So, again, for those of you that may or may not like YAML, again, look at it this way. I have the name, right? Like, what is this thing called? And then how do I configure it inside of the spec, right? So inside of the spec, you can see that I say, hey, I have something called RabbitMQ server. Like that's the name of my RabbitMQ. And it's inside of my Docker network, right? And then this is the port that it's listening on. And then here, I could pass along some other RabbitMQ specific settings there that I need to pass it, right? But it's the same thing too if you want to head over and we take a look at Redis, right? If we look at some of our Redis things, for instance, here, like if I wanted to use Redis, right, I can say pub sub Redis. Again, this metadata is just the name, right? All the stuff from, everything above spec is copy paste, right? So some folks might be, I don't know what this is. I don't know what it is either. I just copy paste it, right? The important stuff happens in the spec because that's where you specify your settings. Excuse me. So here you can see I'm doing something like I'm specifying this is Redis service and the Redis service is running on this port, right? One of the things that you might be noticing is a little bit different from the RabbitMQ one is that instead of me just having the name of the value for the password, I'm actually getting it from a secret store. And that secret store is also configured inside of Dapr, right? But see, now this is one of the ways that like my application doesn't have to store this information, right? My app doesn't have to store the password to Redis and the password to RabbitMQ and the password to all these other things, right? Like I could just let that happen on the side of Dapr, right? And then now I can start to control these things from that side. But again, as we're looking through this file, nothing in here says anything about what's the password, right? Like, But if I look here at the bottom where it says auth, it says I want to use the secret store called local secrets, right? And if, like I mentioned before, I could use different types of secret stores. So I can have a secret store that's like HashiCorp Vault or Azure Key Vault, or I could use a simple local file that I'm using here. Only use the local file for testing and not for deployment. Please don't do it. I don't want to get in trouble. Don't put your secrets in a file in production, right? But as you can see here, I could say, where's that configuration? Where'd it go? Here we go. I have a local secrets configuration. This is the metadata, right? Copy paste. And this part at the bottom is the settings, right? What's the name of the file that I want to connect to? It's Dapr local secrets.json. And here it is, secrets.json. This is my, this is some password here that I put in here, right? Like that's the password that I'm using for Redis. But again, I just have it here for testing and showing you an example of how, my app doesn't have to have this. This could be in Key Vault. This could be up in the cloud somewhere. It doesn't have to be here in your app, but you could use it like this solely for the purposes of testing, right? Let's take a look now inside of here and let's see how we can set up distributed tracing. Now, distributed tracing is pretty cool. It's one of those things that when you start building microservices, like you don't think you need it until like you're like halfway through your project, and you're like, okay, well, this code is working, and this service is working, and that service is working, but when I put them together, they don't work. And I'm trying to figure out at what point in time in my workflow does it stop working, right? I need to be able to trace it throughout and figure out, well, where does this thing stop, right? Like, where is this thing breaking? And that's where distributed tracing becomes pretty fun. And so from a Dapr perspective, all you got to do is something like this, right? You could specify, hey, I want to use Zipkin. And then what's the name of my Zipkin server? What's the port that it's running on? And, the path that it needs. And then Dapr will be able to do that for you as well. So let's take a look at my browser, and I can show you what some of these things kind of look like. So I mentioned before that I was running RabbitMQ. So I'm going to log into my RabbitMQ instance, right? And one of the things, I'll zoom in a little bit. One of the things that you'll notice in RabbitMQ is that, for instance, if I come to queues, notice this thing is here, Contoso Dapr Rabbit Checkout, right? I didn't create this, right? This is something that, Dapr creates for me, which is great, right? If I come in here and I look at exchanges, this is not something that I created, right? There's an exchange here for checkout. Like once you configure Dapr, like it'll just create these things for you. And then as you can imagine too, as Dapr shuts down, depending on how you have your thing set up, it'll just go away, right? Like it won't linger around if you don't want it to. But again, I'm just showing you, again, as the administration of these things happen, these are things that like get created and then also purged out of your system based on how you have your things set up in Dapr. I'm also using this thing here. This is called Redis Insight. Like it's a little utility app. This is really cool for looking at things like this. Now, let's say I go ahead and let's pop some stuff in here. I'm just going to add some stuff to the cart, right? Now, I'm using Redis for a state store, even though it's popping up here. If I come back to this, what should happen, I think I got to refresh this thing because they don't show up by default. There you go. Right. So notice now I have some state, right? And then there you see, the quantity of my products, right? I have 2 of this, whatever that is, light up corsage or whatever. And one of those things, right? If you see me kind of come through, I'll keep clicking on these things. Click, 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 click. I wish this thing would auto refresh, but it doesn't do that. I'll go ahead and refresh this thing, and then you can see, again, my state is updated, right? Because Dapr knows, hey, I want you to put this thing in Redis because that's how we configured it. But again, I'm not the one that's controlling it. And I'll go ahead and I'll purge this. I'll go ahead and hit submit, right? And then when we come back and we refresh this, is this a refresh button? There you go, right? So you notice I refreshed it and then it's gone, right? My state has disappeared. This thing no longer exists, right? But again, Dapr manages those things for me. Like that's not stuff that we have to manage. Okay. Now let's take a look at Zipkin. So like we mentioned before, Zipkin is a tool that's really helpful in doing distributed tracing. Now, if I go ahead and hit the search button, what you're seeing here is my apps that I created. I'm going to zoom in because I know that's super small. But what you're seeing here is my apps that are created. I have my checkout processor. I have my website. I have my web API. But again, because I've plugged in Dapr and I've told it to use Zipkin as my source for tracing, I could look and see how the information flows throughout my application. So notice, you see that, I don't know if you can see, but there's like a little dot that keeps flowing by every now and again. Whenever my website starts up, it's going to make a call to the products API, right? And then the products API is going to send back some information. And I might get information about all the products. I might get information about one product. I might want to update some things, like that goes down this route. And now whenever I'm publishing a message, right? And even though I'm publishing through Redis or RabbitMQ, right, I could still see where it's flowing to, right? So I could see how it's flowing from my website into my checkout processor, right? Again, Zipkin is just one thing that you could use for this. If folks are going to the cloud, you could use application insights because there's an app map thing that you could use. Jaeger is another thing that visualizes some of these application traces. That's really useful as well. But again, you can imagine I might have a lot more services than these, right? This is just 3 services, but you might have tons of them. And you want to know how is your information flowing. Like these visualizations are really helpful as you're building applications. But again, I don't have anything in my code, no packages, no configuration in my application code that knows anything about Zipkin. This just happens because those Dapr sidecars can handle a lot of that stuff for me, right? So again, as a developer, I could really just focus on what I'm working on and not necessarily digging into some of those pieces. Okay, so that was the observability piece, right? What's cool about the observability piece? So I showed you how it uses Zipkin. It's actually using OpenTelemetry internally, right? It's able to use some of those OpenTelemetry like standards and APIs to be able to send your messages to different places. So like I said, like you could use App Insights, you could use Datadog. You know, Prometheus is another thing that folks use to capture, you know, metrics and logging and things of that nature if you want to. You know, you can configure the sample rates and all kinds of stuff. I think there's even a Dapr chart. I think the charts is what you call them for Grafana. So again, if you wanted to have like a dashboard like this and put it up on your monitor in your team room and just kind of monitor how things are going, right? You can see things like, you know, the call latency and the memory and the error rates and, you know, system health and those types of things. Again, you can get all this for free because, again, Dapr is open source and it's free, and you should be able to get some of these things in there as well. Okay. Moving forward a little bit, there's a couple other features that I didn't have a chance to put into the demo because it's a lot. I definitely want to leave some more time at the end too so we could talk about it and talk about, you know, questions and anything that y'all might be concerned about. But, you know, Dapr has input-output triggers. If folks are familiar with like that Azure Functions serverless like, you know, eventing type model, like we can do that as well. We have different bindings that we could use on either side. So whether we want to, you know, take inputs from things like social media or trigger things like, you know, database inserts or setting messages with Twilio or anything of the sort, like we could totally do that. Dapr has a virtual actor framework, which is really cool. A lot of folks always ask me, like, how does this compare to things like Orleans, Microsoft Orleans, or Akka.net, or, you know, name your actor framework? And the thing that I always say is, you know, always remember that Dapr is not programming language agnostic. So you can have actors in different programming languages. You can have .NET actors and Python actors and Java actors. Whereas things like Orleans and Akka.net and things of that nature are very specific to like the platform or the programming language that they're running. And that's not a good or a bad thing. It's just you got to figure out like what makes sense for your applications. Maybe Orleans and Akka make more sense. Or maybe, you know, if you just want some lightweight actors and not some of those other things that those frameworks offer, maybe, you know, maybe just using Dapr might make sense for you as well, right? Yeah, and again, as you could see, like we do the same thing, right? Like there's an HTTP endpoint that you use to interact with the actors, right? And then we also have a placement service that works there as well. Now, I want to say it was March this year. I'm sorry, May this year. So just a couple of months ago, we released Dapr 1.2. So I was really excited about this release because this added some additional capabilities that, you know, I was a big fan of. One, we had some new components that were added from some different companies. So like folks like Alibaba and the Man Group, which are, you know, some, you know, cloud infrastructure folks, submitted like some different components. if you're familiar with console, console from HashiCorp, essentially what it does is service discovery, like it's a service discovery component. But until this release came out, you had to use whatever the Dapr facilities were. But now, like, you have a separate building block that we could use for DNS resolution. So now you can plug in things like console, and maybe someone will contribute like a different one or something like that, right? PubSub without cloud events. Oh, you know what? That reminded me. I did not show you the checkout processor. Shame on me for not doing that. Let me show you what the checkout processor looked like, because if I don't show you, then that slide's not going to make any sense to you. So if we take a look at the checkout processor, so again, it's just another .NET application, right? But one of the things that we did in here, I have a Dapr controller, right? Now, one of the things that you have to do is you have to specify to Dapr, like, what are the things that I want to listen to? So here you can notice that I'm saying I want to listen to the PubSub, right? And this is the name of the component. Remember, we configured the name of the component inside of our YAML file. I want to listen to this PubSub for this topic, and this is the routes I want you to send it to. It's almost like specifying a callback, right? So whenever an event fires or whenever a message gets published for checkout, I want you to send it to the checkout route. And here's the checkout route right here, right? So whenever /checkout gets hit on on this controller, it's going to go ahead and execute this function. And one of the things that Dapr does is it uses this thing called cloud events. Like cloud events is a standard. I think it's fully supported by the CNCF, and it's trying to be adopted by a lot of message brokers and just distributed systems messaging tooling. It essentially allows you to create wrappers around messages, like very well-known consistent wrappers. One of the ways I kind of think about it is like, imagine HTTP, and HTTP has a request payload, but then in addition to that payload, there's headers that you could look at, right? And so before you read the payload, you could look at the headers and you can make decisions about the contents of that message, right? Well, I think up until now, like, there was really no standard that specified what the shape of that looked like for messaging events, right? Because again, like, there are very well-known HTTP headers, content type and cache control and those types of things. But for messaging, we didn't really have something like that. And this is kind of where cloud events comes into play. So because Dapr does rely on standards, it's going to send us messages using like this cloud events pattern. So what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, from the request that comes in, I want you to read it as a cloud event. And then I could start looking at things like the ID and the type and the data content type. Like, I could start looking at the metadata of the message, and then I can decide what do I want to do with that message or not, right? And so in a very short, compressed way, like, that's some of the benefits of using cloud events. So now as you're using like these different brokers, we could still have a very consistent payload, like we know what it looks like, and then we can expect the headers to see like what's in there. So even though we can do that, there are some, there's some libraries and some platforms that don't fully support cloud events yet. We have a .NET package that does that, and that's what you saw, excuse me, when I showed you that CS_proj file for the checkout processor. I have a package that knows how to read cloud events in .NET, but I don't know, you might be in another language like, I don't know, C++ or Python, or I don't know if they have any. I'm just saying, hypothetically, you might be in a different one, and they don't know how to talk to cloud events. They don't know how to serialize it or deserialize it. Now we can set up Dapr so that it could say, hey, whenever you send me a message, I want you to pull the contents out of that cloud events envelope and then just give me the data, right? Like, don't give me the headers and all that other stuff. Like, just give me the stuff in the middle. And so that was something that was released and made available in 1.2. Another thing that we have is this thing called API scoping. Now with API scoping, I showed you like we have those different building blocks. Now you could turn them off, right? So you could say, for this Dapr sidecar, I'm going to turn off state management. I'm going to turn off publish subscribe. I'm going to turn off stuff, because by default, like, they're all turned on, even if you don't configure them or not. And you might say, hey, I don't want anyone to use these APIs. I'm just going to turn them off, right? And so that's something that you could do here now in 1.2. And this is the name resolution that I was talking to you folks about a little bit earlier, where now, instead of just using MDNS or, the Kubernetes thing, you can use an external DNS provider, like something like HashiCorp Console, and now you could discover where your Dapr containers are or your Dapr sidecars are using Console. Now, why do we want this? Why is this a good idea? Well, it's a good idea because when you think about it, what actually happens, went far too quickly. When you think about it, when you're inside of Kubernetes or if you're running on local hosts, how do you discover sidecars that are on a different network or in a different data center or somewhere else? It's kind of hard for you to do that, right? Like, because the DNS, your DNS is not going to be able to go all the way over there. At least MDNS is not going to do that. Kubernetes DNS is not going to do that, right? You have to, you'll have to do some special things to make that happen. Well, now, now that we can have external DNS providers, that makes that situation a little bit easier, right? So, hey, I might be like, I'm in Florida and you might have a data center in Africa or, London or somewhere else. Now I can, use the power of, these external DNSs and I can start reaching out and grabbing stuff, which is really cool. And again, this was just released in 1.2. So right now there's only console in there, but I can imagine, we'll have some other things popping up to fill that space too. Okay. So just before I end off, I just want to share some resources. People always ask, like, what's the best place for me to go to learn about Dapr? And my answer is always like, there's tons of places to go to learn about Dapr. You can go to dapr.io. There's tons of docs there. Actually, I think I have it open still. If you head over to dapr.io and you can click on the getting started, right? Like this for me is always like the best place to go. To come to the getting started, install it based on your operating system, Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever you're using, and then kind of just follow through. Like that's a great place to go. There's the GitHub repo. There's a blog. There's the Discord channel. I'm a big fan of the Discord channel. I think I actually even have it open here. Yeah, I kind of do. Let it load for a second. But yeah, you can come over here to the Discord channel, and then the team is in here. They're making announcements. What is this? How do you close this? There we go. There's different channels for the different SDKs, the .NET SDK, Go SDK, Rust. There's a Rust SDK now. I didn't even know that. See, there you go. I actually really love coming in here too and checking out the show and tell. Here you can see different folks from the community that are like, here are some things that I built with Dapr. Here are blog posts that I've written and samples that I've created. So I like to come in here and hang out because there's just always cool stuff that people are doing and they're always here to share it. But again, if you want to learn about Dapr, those are good places to go. There's a Dapr for .NET developers ebook that's available. The ebook is free. It's online. And when I say it's free like you don't have to put in your email address to get it emailed to you. You could just go straight to the link and it'll take you to docs.microsoft.com and you can learn how to start building Dapr applications with .NET. So with that being said, I'm just going to hang out. I'm going to wait and see if folks have any questions. Let me know what you think. Do you think this is crazy? Do you think this makes sense? Is this something that you want to use? Let me know, and then we could talk about it.
We had a question from Jose. It says, can I run Dapr on my Windows PC using Docker Desktop and Kubernetes? And then it says single node cluster when starting Docker Desktop.
Yes. Yes, you can. And one of the ways, I mean, we actually even have samples for that. But if you look at here, right, like so if I want to run it in Windows, right, I can install it in Windows. Or if I wanted to run it in Kubernetes, there's actually a Kubernetes tutorial in here somewhere. There's a Kubernetes tutorial. Let me see. Kubernetes. There we go. How to get Dapr up and running in Kubernetes. Like there's tons of stuff. And this will run on a single node cluster. Yes. So you could totally do that.
And one of the things I've always liked in all the presentations and interactions I've seen with Dapr is kind of with any tool is kind of how much of a cost of entry is it? Not necessarily from monetarily, but kind of from a, pretty much every tool tries to solve some problem, and there's, it's supposed to make it easier for you, but sometimes you find it like just understanding what's going on, or maybe there's too much presented all at once, but it seems like a good balance of, a guided where to go, and it's not too overwhelming at first.
Yeah, I think, so to me, the good and the bad of like having a really rich ecosystem is like there's a lot of complexity with like choice. You know what I mean? Because that means that I have to evaluate the choice or all of the choices, right? Like, how do I know what's the right messaging thing for me to use? What's the right DNS thing for me to use? You know, what's the right state store for me to use? Like, which ones of these has the features that I need or don't need? Or maybe I just need something simple. Like, I don't know, right? And as you kind of go through building your applications, I got to install this other package. I got to get rid of this one. I got to set this thing up. I got to, there's work that needs to happen. And not that work is a bad thing, but if you could save time and abstract some of these things and focus on, like, I don't know, building your sports app or building your entertainment app or building your shopping cart app or whatever the case is, like, I'm pretty sure like your managers and business people would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think too, from a secure, software development lifecycle perspective, being able to abstract that and kind of think about it, where you can kind of make the decisions and not have to install a ton of packages that are just tied in, and you can go, well, let me think about it. What do we want to do with this? And the implementation seems pretty straightforward to use Dapr as a tool to, you have quite a bit of choices with it.
For sure. And, for my application, this was a .NET demo. It doesn't have to be a .NET demo. It could be any process that you can run on the machine, right? When I say process, like any process that you've written that you could run on a machine. It could be Python, it could be Go, it could be C++, it could be whatever. As long as it can talk to and respond to HTTP or gRPC, then it's good to go.
Looks like we have another one here. It says, any news about YARP, yet another reverse proxy?
Yeah, YARP. So YARP's not a Dapr project, but we could talk about YARP a little bit. So for folks that might not be familiar about YARP, I think this is also on the Microsoft repo. There we go, reverse proxy. That's what it is. So YARP, for those that might be familiar, YARP is yet another reverse proxy. That's what YARP, that's what it stands for. The purpose of YARP was not just to create another reverse proxy, as the name says, but the goal was to create an extensible reverse proxy for .NET developers, right? So, we've had a lot of folks come and say, hey, we want to be able to write code, you know what I mean, and put it in like the proxy layer and take it out of our application. So you think about things that proxies do for you, right? Like they do filtering, they do things like throttling, for example, caching. Like proxies do a lot of things for you. It'll be great if I could have some parts of some of the those cross-cutting concerns, I suppose, like in the proxy and out of my app, right? I know that the proxy could route to one or many apps that are sitting behind of it. What's happening with YARP? YARP is still active, man. Let's see, when was the last release? Oh, I hate when it does this. I really hate this. Okay, hold on one second. Let me move this to another window. YARP is still active. They had a release just in April. So just this past April was the last release of YARP. And they continue to add new features to it every day. Definitely want folks to go in and check it out and see, let us know what they're thinking about it, for sure.
We have a question from CJ. It says, can Dapr be used in scenarios where discovery should not be universal, but rather quasi-namespaced? For example, some services and apps can see some things and use them, but others cannot.
Yeah, you could totally do that. So I didn't talk about this, but it's definitely something that you could do. I think it's in the docs too. Let me see how we could show you that. I think it's in security, but yeah, you could go into your app and you could say, I'm trying to remember how do you set this up. But anyway, you could go into your app and you could say, okay, is this what I'm talking about? There we go. So here's the allow list, right? It might be what you're talking about. So for instance, one of the things that I could do is I could say, I'm going to allow certain apps to call certain APIs, right? Okay, like what I was talking about from a components perspective. But I could also say, like my web API, like my website app can't call the what would I call that thing? That products API as an example, right? So it works with the Dapr things, but it works with, the service control. Oh, here it is. Perfect. Apply service access control. There we go. So I could say, I'm trying to find an example. Right. Right. So you could specify this access control on a very granular level, right? All depending on like what you want to do. So you could say, hey, I don't want to turn on these Dapr APIs, or I don't want certain services to talk to certain other services, and then as you can see here, you could specify the namespace and all those types of things.
And Jose wants to know, are you all happy about Windows subsystem for Android in Windows 11?
Wow. I heard the announcement. I haven't dug into it too much. I just heard that Android apps are going to be running on Windows. I mean, we've had a good relationship with like Android apps in general. Like we have a good partnership with Samsung, particularly when it comes to Office and Office interoperability. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it also gives Android developers like a wider audience to deploy their apps to. I know we're in the United States, but if you look at the market share, there's more Android apps and phones than there are for iOS, right? So that now this kind of just opens up the world for just some new ways for developers to take advantage of. Yeah. But while folks are there, again, I'd love to know what you all think about Dapr. I mean, this is a user group, so let's talk, man. Like, are you all building microservice applications? Are you thinking about building microservice applications? What's everyone kind of doing and working on or thinking about working on? Are you all folks using Kubernetes? I know a little bit of Kubernetes, but I'm not like a Kubernetes ninja or anything like that. Like I'm really curious to hear what people are doing and what they're working on, and if they think this Dapr stuff makes sense. Like, let me know.
Yeah, I've been considering. I have kind of some personal projects that I've been considering, kind of messing around with some microservices and converting them over. I haven't really moved past the kind of the design stage and thinking about it. I'm still kind of trying to come up with a game plan before I move forward.
Yeah. I have a lot of friends locally that are developers, and they're still getting up to speed with what containers are. And I get it, right? Like, because everyone doesn't run at the same pace. You know what I mean? And like they try to understand like what are some of the development benefits of using containers, and then they're like, okay, well, I have these containers. How do I manage these containers? And then what are the tools do I need? What are the tools do I need on my machine? And then what are the tools I need like in my infrastructure? And then we start talking about like Nomad and Kubernetes and Docker Swarm and all these other options people have for like managing these types of things.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about too. Just kind of, I like to think. I don't know, maybe not so much realistically, but philosophically of, how does it compare to start from scratch with microservices rather than transfer, an existing monolith over? It seems like it would be, it seems like it'd be easier, really. I would think if you're just building one. I don't know how common that would be either.
I don't know. It's an interesting question because I think it's hard to. So it's like the question, like how, like what do you call a microservice, right? And I mean, rhetorical question, right? But like how micro is a microservice? Like how do you know, like these are the pieces that I want to break apart? And it's kind of hard to know that if you don't have an app to break apart. You know what I mean? Or unless you've had some experience building something before, now you're rebuilding it over from scratch. It's a new app, but it's really an old app you're trying to replace. Because a lot of times what happens is people. Some of the failures I've seen with folks is that they're like, we're going to do microservices and we're going to build all our new apps in microservices, but like they don't know what are those boundaries that constitutes a single service, right? Like, should a single HTTP method be a microservice? Probably not, in my opinion, probably not, right? But then should my whole payment gateway be a microservice? I don't know. Maybe not, right? Like what's the data that I'm going to be sharing across my different domains, right? Like you think about, I have the concept of a customer or a product. It has to probably be in the UI and it has to be in I might have a CRM system. Maybe my CRM is a microservice. I don't know, right? Like, and I have payroll, and I have all these different types of things like products and reports. Like all of them have the concept of a customer. You know what I mean? Like how do I share that around these different microservices that I have? Like what's the best way for me to kind of break those apart? And even with that, how do I do reporting? How do I report on a microservice architecture, right? Like I might have different pieces of information scattered all over the place. You know what I mean? How do we do these types of things? I'm not saying that they're not these problems are solved problems, but like we have to think about them, right? We have to think about like what are the implementation details that we need to consider, right? Like where's our data warehouse going to live, and like how is it going to talk? Are we going to use like a CQRS part, and then are we going to do things like event sourcing and all these types of things? Like, we still have to have like an architectural conversation. You know what I mean? Regardless of whether we're doing Dapr or not, like we have to figure it out.
Yeah, for me, that's the funnest part of the coding is kind of, breaking everything down to decisions and going, well, why would I do this versus why would I do that, and what are our values, and so on and so forth. For me, that's far more fun than any other aspect of software.
Yeah, I mean, I think software developers at heart are just people that like to solve puzzles. Like that's our job, is to solve puzzles at the end of the day. And some puzzles are more fun than others, but at the end of the day, we're solving puzzles, right? And if you love your job, like you probably love solving puzzles and finding solutions to problems.
Definitely. We've had quite a number of questions. We're going to have to catch up here.
Sure.
It says, if we have several WCF services, do they need to be converted to gRPC to use Dapr?
No, I mean, WCF can speak HTTP, so no. You could just make HTTP endpoints. I know there's HTTP bindings for WCF. WCF will only run on Windows today. So if you're going to use Dapr, and if you're going to use containers and stuff like that, like you're probably going to run Windows containers versus Linux containers. And then there's a whole other conversation we can have about Windows versus Linux containers. But if the question is solely is to use Dapr, do I have to change or not use WCF? And the answer is no. You could use WCF. Just use the HTTP binding because WCF can speak to HTTP.
Sounds good. Somebody asks, will it play with some Kubernetes microservice options like Knative? And it says directly, not the event ingress.
I'm not sure. I mean, we don't have any support for Knative today. That being said, that might be something that we could do. But as of today, like there's nothing that supports it right now.
Okay. Somebody says, this is so cool. We are working on breaking a Ruby app backend into domain-based services, and it looks like Dapr would work well to get a clean separation with minimal plumbing work on Ruby.
Yeah, again, I think that's the whole point, right? Like, is we want to make it easier for folks. And I think that's a good example, right? Like, here, this person has an application, and now obviously they know how the app works. At least I hope they know how their own app works. And then they're going to go through the process of deconstructing it into pieces that make sense. And, I can imagine they're probably going to want to make use of the service discovery pieces, right? And being able to call and figure out where those other things are within the architecture. I can imagine you probably want to do some distributed tracing because you want to make sure that the messages are going in the right way. I can imagine you want to do things like maybe pub sub. Maybe in your Ruby app, I don't know, I'm just making it up, but maybe you're using, a Redis or a RabbitMQ or a Nats or ActiveMQ or whatever to pass these messages around, right? Like, your developers now just need to learn how to send HTTP requests to Dapr, and they don't need to, be too concerned about like the other pieces around.
Yeah, I think it's cool to see it being helpful real time, where people learn from what you're saying right away. That instant feedback of helpfulness is very cool to see.
Yeah. I saw someone ask about where is Dapr being used, and there is an issue for that, which is kind of interesting. I think it's literally called "Who is using Dapr" or something of that sort.
Yeah, Jeremy posted a link in the chat as well to some people who are using it.
Yeah, here's literally an issue of a bunch of folks that are using Dapr. You know, China, Australia, the UK, United States. Yeah, there's tons of folks in here that are using it. I'm pretty sure if you go to the what's it called? I'm pretty sure if you go to the homepage, I'm pretty sure we have them on the homepage too. I'd be surprised if we didn't. There we go. Right, like companies using Dapr. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of folks using Dapr. Obviously, we're using Dapr too because we built it. It'd be kind of silly if we didn't use it. But yeah, there's lots of folks using Dapr. Big companies, small companies, hobbyists, stuff like that. Because again, one of the good things about Dapr is that it's very lightweight. It's not a heavy process. Your process, like the code that you write, is probably going to be bigger than Dapr. You know what I mean? Like all Dapr is doing is it's like a funnel, right? Like it's taking in requests and it's passing it along, and it's applying some configuration and policies to it. But there's really not, there's no heavy processing that's happening within Dapr itself.
We got another question. Can we call GraphQL services via Dapr?
Yeah, you can. I mean, GraphQL at the end of the day is just HTTP. You know what I mean? Like to call a GraphQL, like you use a HTTP post, I believe, is what they do for all of their requests. But yeah, you could totally call GraphQL. So what would happen? Let's say you had. Let me head over to my code. So whenever you call a GraphQL thing, I'll find an example of one of my. Let's go to the processor, right? Like let's go to the product service. So GraphQL just has its own endpoint. So you can imagine, where is that code? That's add. Where's? Anyway, so let's imagine this was a GraphQL endpoint, right? So like this, that's here, like this after the method, right? Because remember, this is a Dapr templated URL, right? So if this was a GraphQL, you just put in like my GraphQL path, right? Whatever the case is, right? And then inside of here, I should probably put it in this one instead, right? But imagine I did it up here. And your content, right? Because what you're passing into GraphQL is like a JSON document that specifies your query, right? So that's just the content, right? So you create your payload and you call the endpoint. Magic, we have GraphQL, right? It just kind of works. Because again, GraphQL is just HTTP, right? It's the difference with GraphQL and REST, because I think a lot of folks always seem to think like it's hugely different. The convention is different. It's still HTTP, right? There's still headers. There's still URLs and request bodies and status codes. Like still HTTP. Just the convention is different.
Very cool. We have one here. Would Dapr eventually support transient fault handling library like Poly?
Yeah, there's some discussion in there about that, and I think it would be great if folks comment on it. It's something that's been spoken about. That's not it. Where is this thing? There we go. There's something that's been spoken about, but we haven't finalized on it yet. But if folks, I can't type for nothing today. If folks are interested, definitely head over here, and we could talk about it. Like there's definitely some issues in here about that error handling or transient faults, right? There's an issue in here somewhere. I don't know where it is, but I don't remember where it is. But there's an issue in here that talks about it. That specifically talks about retries. I think that's what it's called. I think it's called retry issue. Yeah, retry pattern. There we go. So this is what you probably want, right? The retry pattern in Dapr, which would cover things like poly and transient issues and things of that nature. And then you see this, retries for gRPC and retries for PubSub, and so it's a thing that's being discussed. It hasn't been finalized on yet, but if it's something that you'd like to see, definitely weigh in on the conversation, right? Because this is the only way we're going to get it right, is if people let us know what we want, what they want it to look like.
Yeah, I hear that's the trick is it's good because people use it and people use it because it's good, right?
Yeah.
It kind of becomes a cycle.
Yep. Exactly.
And
I
we
mean,
had a
people talk about what they care about, right? Like if they don't care about it, then it's kind of hard to get contributions, you know?
right, and we had one, Cecil. It says, "Do you have a link for your demo code?"
Yeah. I do. So I'll paste this in the chat somewhere, but mine is just at GitHub, Cecil Phillip, and it's at Contoso Crafts. So let me tell you a little bit about this project or this repo. This repo is kind of different because there's nothing really in main. Like everything is in branches. And so I have a lot of different implementations of the same app in different branches. So I have an implementation in Orleans using an actor framework. I have a Thai version that's just using Thai, no Dapr. I have Steel Toe. If folks have ever heard about using Steel Toe for building microservices. Steel Toe comes out of like the VMware group of folks. And then I also have a Dapr version. Now, this README is a little old. And I say it's old because if you come here, you might notice I have way more branches than I showed. And one of the reasons is because if you look at some of these things, you'll see I have a Dapr and a Dapr SDK branch, right? So this one just uses raw HTTP, but we also have client SDKs for .NET and for other languages. So if you wanted to see how to use the client SDK for .NET, you could, because you could switch over to this branch, and you could kind of go to like the same component, right? So let's say I went to the website, right? Like if I went to the website, I click on services, I probably have a Dapr service, right? But then one of the things you'll notice, instead of me using HTTP Client Factory, which is what I'm using here, right? Instead, I'm using Dapr clients and I'm making the calls instead. But like, look at how much smaller the code is, right? Like these are pretty much all one-liners. Like this could be a one-liner, right? I only because I declared a variable, you know what I mean? But versus being 4 lines of code, they could be 1 line of code, right? But that's the difference that we're really talking about. But it's the benefit is, do I want to use the client or do I want to just use my own HTTP client? Now, there's 2 reasons why you might want to do one versus the other. If you want to just use the Dapr client, that's fine. And then, again, it makes your code nice and easy. It's testable, so you can mock it and unit test it and things of that nature. If you want to use your HTTP client, then you could start using some of your own middleware, delegating handlers, any other investments that you might have put into the library, right? So someone mentioned Poly, right? Like we have extensions for Poly off of HTTP client. So you could do that if you wanted to, right? And just use your own HTTP client. But if you don't care about middleware and some of that other stuff, then totally fine. Like you could just use our Dapr client and it'll work well too. And again, you could use this not just for method invocation. It works for states. It works for secrets and pub sub and like all the things, right? So totally up to folks, whatever they want to use.
Everybody seemed to be very pleased with the presentation, and there was a lot of engagement.
Like
I love it.
Taking a nap or something.
Yeah, I'll say this was pretty phenomenal. Like I've been kind of following Dapr for a while now, and really seeing this demo with the explanations of how each of the individual components interact and all the extensibility you can do. I kind of want to hop into this. Like right after this, I really want to hop into this.
Yeah, Dapr is really fun and I think this is the case for most people, but I could be wrong. If you work in an environment that there's multiple programming languages, right? Because one of the things that we see a lot in the .NET space, there's tons of actor frameworks, there's tons of distributed systems things and messaging frameworks and all kinds of stuff that work well as long as you're writing .NET on both sides, right? This Dapr works well with anything, but then we have to talk about like what the drawbacks are, right? Because now it's like, okay, I have multiple languages, but like now, I might be losing some functionality that I might need. I'll give you an example because I think it's good to talk about the good and the bad, right? I'd be remiss if I come on and I only talk about the good stuff. If you're using something like Redis as an example, Redis does more than just key value, right? Redis has streams, Redis has different data types and all kinds of stuff that you might want to use. So then it might make sense that I have a Redis SDK inside of my app, and I just use that as like a hard dependency. You know what I mean? So now on the Dapr side, like you don't get access to the data types of Redis. You don't get access to like controlling those details. The only thing you could tell Dapr is, here's some data. Let me know when I can get it back. And then, you do like this, like I'm done. You know what I mean? So it depends on what your app needs, right? Like, do you need to be able to control like those little knobs and buttons and all those things? Or are you fine just, kind of like that person, we had someone talking about like they're going to deconstruct their Ruby application. They got to figure out, okay, well, these are like the lightweight pieces, you know what I mean? And these are the things that I need a hard dependency on. Like if you remember my code, when I was showing it a little bit earlier, my products API is the only thing in here that has a dependency, and that's on the MongoDB driver. And I want it in there because I'm running certain queries for data that I need to be able to specify a query language, right? Dapr doesn't support query languages. You see what I'm saying? But it does do insert. It does do like, retrieval. You know what I mean? So again, you got to think about like what really makes sense for the app that you're trying to build. So for me, Dapr makes sense because I get service discovery, I get pub sub, but then I'm still gonna like use my database package. I'm going to use that thing. You know what I mean? But everything else I could let Dapr use. Which kind of goes into like another question a lot of people always ask. And I'm trying to answer questions that I think people are going to ask before I disappear. A lot of type of questions that people ask are, do I have to use all the building blocks? No, you don't have to at all. Like you could just use whatever you feel like using. You know what I mean? So if you tell me, hey, I only want to use pub sub and I'm going to figure out the rest, that's fine. Right? Or if you just want to use Dapr for managing secrets, that's fine. It's not like a all or nothing type of thing like some other frameworks might be. Use the parts that you want, use the parts that make sense, and then you can figure out what you want to do for the other things.
I do have an awkward question. Is it possible to run Dapr in IIS?
In IIS? You can run it next to IIS because Dapr is a process, right? So, you can run the process next to it. And what you could do, so where's my thing? Let's do this. I'm going to pull up the terminal. So let's say, right, I have Dapr installed on this machine, right? I'm going to, is that big enough? Right, sir, I'm going to assume that's big enough. Hopefully that's big enough. So IIS is going to run on some exe, right? Like IIS, or what is it called? WS something dot exe, whatever it is, right?
W3 WP, yeah.
Yeah, there's some executable that IIS is running at. But when IIS runs, IIS will be listening on port 80, right? So IIS will be, localhost 80, right? Whatever it is, you know what I mean? So you don't run Dapr in IIS, but you run it next to it. So you could always just say Dapr D, app, what's it called? Dash app ID, and then call it, I don't know, IIS, whatever you want to call it, right? And then I could say dash app dash ports 80, right? So now whenever Dapr starts, it's going to be like IIS is running on the machine in its own process. Dapr is running next to IIS in its own process. So it doesn't matter what web server you use. It could be IIS, it could be Apache, it could be whatever. You could be running on port 443 if you want to, and using, SSL certificates. It's whatever, like whatever port you're running at. And now just remember, for every instance of the application, you're going to have another instance of Dapr, right? I guess one of the things I'd wonder about, Dapr does not do virtual hosts. So, like you can hit IIS, and then it'll direct to a virtual directory based on like the host name or something like that. I don't think Dapr would not do that. Like Dapr doesn't have awareness to know about virtual hosts within web servers. You know what I mean? So, if you have multiple addresses listening to a single port, like, I don't know, jeremy.com and kellen.com and cecil.com, we're all hitting port 80 or port 443, like Dapr's not going to be able to know which one this belongs to. You know what I mean? You could, and again, like we're talking about using the like your own HTTP handler or HTTP client, like you could append host names as a header to the request. Like that could happen. And now that would just get forwarded along to your web server, and then hopefully your web server will be able to figure that out. But yeah, I think that's probably the way I'd approach it. I mean, I haven't run IIS in a long time because I don't have to anymore. But if it was me, like that's the way I'd kind of approach looking at running Dapr next to IIS.
Yeah, I figured I'd ask that question just because knowing that it's not anything I don't think anyone would try to do, but I'm sure there's the one or two that might think
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And again, I think that kind of goes into the notion that the story that we're trying to make people understand is, at least for me, like microservices is not a cloud thing, right? And a lot of people think about it that way just because, that's how marketing sells it, right? Like marketing across the industry sells microservices as a cloud thing and something that I need someone else to do for me. And it's really not. Like microservices is more so around like patterns and practices. So if you think about, maybe you do run IIS, right? And maybe you have a farm of IIS machines, you know what I mean? Next to those IIS machines, you could put Dapr instances next to all of those, and that's fine. You know what I mean? Because there might be one or more services that you want to pull out of that. So let's say your IIS does everything except PubSub, right? And so now like your app can call through Dapr to get PubSub, and it could funnel out to outer space, right? And whatever, you know what I mean? And pull that information back. Like it doesn't really matter at that point. So you can run it on your machine, you can run it on premises, you can run it in containers, you can run it in systemd on Linux, whatever you want to do. Like, it's just a process, you know what I mean? And it's a process that runs next to the process that you wrote with your code.
So as long as you have HTTP or gRPC, that's all you would need.
That's it.
And
that's it.
Go ahead.
No, that's it. Windows, Mac, whatever. I haven't tried it in a Chromebook. I know someone's going to ask me about Chromebooks. I don't know. Okay. I don't own a Chromebook. I've never tried to write software in a Chromebook. I don't know. But like Linux, Mac, Windows, it will run Dapr. And as long as you can speak HTTP, you should be fine.
Perfect. CJ asked real quick, can we horizontally scale Dapr sidecars if needed?
I mean, you'd scale your sidecars with your app, right? It's because the sidecar has to be attached to an app. You know what I mean? Like you can't have two sidecars pointing to one app. That would be problematic. I mean, you could, but it'll be problematic. But if you have, so again, if you look at the Kubernetes analogy of a pod, right? And it doesn't have to be Kubernetes, but you have your unit of deployment is your app and your sidecar. Like that is a single unit of deployment. They're not separate things. You know what I mean? So again, if I have 10 instances of my app, I have 10 sidecars. Like it's a one-to-one relationship throughout the board. So if you want to scale, again, like you really don't scale like multiple apps for one sidecar or one sidecar, or vice versa. You know what I mean? Like it's a one-to-one relationship when you have sidecars next to your process, your web server, your worker service or whatever that you're using.
All right, that makes good sense to me. Well,
I think I have one more question.
Sure, shoot.
Relative. Does this run on, can Dapr run in WSL? Question number one. Question number two, does it support ARM64?
It does run on WSL. Does it run on ARM64? I don't know. That's a good question. Let's find out. I don't know. That's the Docker thing. Does it run on WSL? I'm really not sure. Let's see if it does. Let's see releases. Yep, guess it does. ARM64.
No Windows.
Yep, Windows and Mac, ARM64. So yeah.
I think we need to get Windows ARM64 support for Dapr. It's nice to see Linux ARM64, so that probably means
There's Windows right here.
WSL. I say a D64. We need
Oh, sorry.
ARM64.
Oops. Sorry. I read that wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, me too at first.
Sorry. I read that wrong. I did read that wrong. But yeah.
This
And
is
then
cool.
you can see our Grafana stuff, our Dapr D process. Anything that says operator is Kubernetes things for folks that want Kubernetes things. Yeah. Sentry is a thing. I think Sentry is what generates those MTLS certificates. So those certificates are generated on the fly for you. So you don't have to do certificate management. They're like generated and rotated for you, which is great. But yeah.
Well, do we have any more questions from the chat, or you got any more, Jeremy?
I don't know. This is like very fascinating, and like I said, I've been following it for a while, and it was really nice to see this presentation. Plus, have just all this explanation about how everything works. As I could tell from the chat that a lot of people really appreciate it.
Yeah. Again, I think the thing with, the main things I always want to get folks out with Dapr is any programming language, runs on any host, and just use the pieces that you want, right? Because it's about flexibility at the end of the day. You don't have to use the whole thing. You don't have to use the SDKs if you don't want to, but they're there. You don't have to run it in Kubernetes if you don't want to. Because a lot of people, again, like marketing has people thinking that microservices only run in Kubernetes. That's not the case. You could run them on your own machine without anything. It's fine. It's about choice, right? And I think Dapr is one of those projects. Why I like Dapr is one of those projects that gives you choice. It's not vendor locked in. It's not Azure locked in. It's not cloud locked in. It's not virtual machine or container locked in. Run it wherever you want. Use whatever language you want, and then, hopefully it'll make your life a little bit easier.
Yeah, it sounds very, very straightforward and very, very adaptable, as you said. Simple and adaptable. So that's what more could you ask for? At least starting out. So
yeah, go for it. It's free. It's open source. You can build it yourself. So yeah, go for it.
Sounds good. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up unless either of y'all have any closing remarks.
No, none for me. Again, the only thing I'd say is, download it, try it out. If you find problems, submit an issue. If there's anything you'd want to see, definitely feel free to message me on Twitter or reach out to any of the Dapr folks. They're on Twitter also. I think it's up here somewhere. Where's that thing? Here it goes. Well, yeah, you could come to them. You could, the team is looking at these things and looking at community feedback and whatever's going on. So yeah, definitely feel free to just, don't be afraid to ask questions, I guess is my thing. People get scared sometimes for one reason or the other. Don't be afraid to come on and ask questions.
Yeah, and Cecil is very approachable. All I had to do, you're like, man, this guy I see on the .NET show, and then I just email him and he's like, sure, I'll do it. No problem. And, I want to give a massive thank you to you for coming out and speaking with us.
Sure, no problem.
And just a lot of people being on the receiving end of and needing to pay it forward. You're kind of sowing the future, and I have a very special place in my heart for people who educate and and do it at no cost for people, and just do it for the love of devs and students learning. So thank you very much for coming out.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. I'd come back, as long as the time works out. I'd come back and we could talk about some other topics if you want. We could talk messaging. We could talk micro APIs with .NET. That's going to be a new thing that people are playing around with. That could be interesting. We could talk Azure Service Bus or, anything of the sort. Whatever folks are interested in learning about, and I know about, I can come back and talk about.
Sounds great to me. Anytime. So I'll be in contact with you.
All right, cool. Sounds good. Well, appreciate it, man. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody that's watching and still here. Like 2
Thank
hours
y'all
later.
for coming out. Yeah, no, it's pretty much been consistent amount of people. So yeah, thanks for everybody for coming out.
Awesome.
Have a good night.